Romance in the West wasn't born in a parlor. It was born in the dirt. It was desperation, starvation, and a cold that cracked bone. When Amos looked at the woman standing in the freezing mud of Copper Creek, he saw a ghost waiting to happen. He told her the ugly truth. He had a drafty cabin, rough hands, and absolutely nothing to offer a lady. Her answer didn't just change his mind. It rewrote the rest of his life. The telegram was brief. The undertaker's explanation was even briefer. Clara stood on the boardwalk of Copper Creek, her heavy wool skirt soaking up the muddy rainwater like a wick. Before her sat a pine box. Inside it was Thomas Harding, the man who had paid her stagecoach fare from St. Louis. He was a miner who had promised her a warm stove, a half share in a gold claim, and a respectable name. Now he was just another corpse in a town that manufactured them daily. A collapsed shaft took him 2 days before she arrived. She had 2 trunks. She had $3.14. Clara didn't cry. Tears were a luxury for women who had a warm place to shed them. She simply stared at the rough-hewn pine, running the grim arithmetic in her head. A ticket back east cost $40. A week in the boarding house across the street cost $5. The rain fell harder, turning the street into a slurry of manure and topsoil. Down the boardwalk, Amos watched her. He hadn't intended to linger in town. Copper Creek was a noise Amos tolerated twice a year. He came down from the high timber to trade pelts for coffee, flour, salt, and black powder. He hated the smell of the place. It smelled of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and desperate greed. Amos smelled of pine pitch, wood smoke, and the cured hide of his coat. He was a massive man, built like the granite ridges he called home, with a beard that hid half his face and eyes the color of bruised slate. He slung a 50-pound sack of flour over his shoulder like it was a bedroll. He was turning toward his mules when a man stepped out of the Golden Nugget Saloon and approached Clara. It was Miller. The saloon owner wore a silk vest stained with tobacco spit, and his smile was entirely teeth. "Tragic business, miss," Miller said, eyeing Clara's trunks, then her wet, shivering shoulders. "Harding was a good man. Left you in a terrible spot, I imagine." Clara tightened her grip on her reticule. "I will manage. A town like this is hard on a solitary woman," Miller pressed, stepping closer. "But I run a respectable establishment. Need girls to pour drinks, keep the men company. You'd have a roof, warm bed, food." Clara looked at him. She saw the grease in his hair, the appraisal in his eyes. She knew exactly what kind of company he meant. "I am not a saloon girl, Mr. Miller. Give it a week of starving, sweetheart. You'll be whatever pays." Amos didn't think about it. He rarely thought about other people's problems. Out here, meddling got you shot. But the sheer, quiet dignity in the way the woman held her spine against the freezing rain snagged something in his chest. He dropped the flour sack onto the boardwalk. The heavy thud made the planks shudder. Miller jumped, turning around. He took one look at the mountain man, at the scarred leather, the massive Walker Colt strapped to his hip, and the absolute dead calm in his eyes, and swallowed hard. "You're standing in my way," Amos said. His voice was gravel grinding in a steel pan. Miller backed up, raising his hands. "No trouble, Amos. Just offering the lady my condolences. Offer them from over there." Amos pointed a thick finger back toward the saloon doors. Miller scurried away. Clara didn't swoon. She didn't thank him. She simply wiped a streak of muddy water from her cheek and looked up at him. Way up. "He was right, you know," Clara said, her voice completely devoid of self-pity. I will starve. Amos studied her. Pale skin, blue eyes clouded with exhaustion. Hands that belonged in a parlor, but were currently blue with cold. Town's no place for a woman alone, Amos grunted. I am aware. Got family back east? None that want me. Amos nodded slowly. He picked up his flower. Good luck to you. He turned and walked toward the livery. He was a practical man. He had his supplies. The snows were coming early this year. He needed to be above the timberline by nightfall. He made it exactly 10 steps before he heard the splash of boots in the mud behind him. Amos stopped at his pack mules. He tied the flour sack down, adjusting the diamond hitch with practiced, brutal efficiency. Clara stood 3 feet away, letting the rain hit her. You are a trapper, she said. It wasn't a question. Amos pulled the rope taut. I am. You live in the mountains, a cabin? Yeah. Are you married? Amos paused. He looked at her over the saddle horn. No. Clara took a step closer. The rain plastered her blonde hair to her forehead. She looked tiny next to his mules, but her eyes held a steady, desperate fire. I can cook, she said, her voice tight, fighting the chatter of her teeth. I can mend clothes. I can salt meat. I know how to keep a fire burning. I am strong, and I do not complain. Amos froze. The wind howled down the canyon, bringing the bitter scent of coming snow. He stared at her, genuinely taken aback. What are you saying? I am proposing a transaction. Clara crossed her arms to keep her hands from shaking. I need a roof and food. You need a wife to tend the hearth while you run your trap lines. A man alone in the deep winter is one broken ankle away from starving. We marry. Today. Right now. Amos let out a harsh barking laugh. It held no humor. He stepped toward her. He wanted her to understand exactly how insane she was. He wanted to scare her back to the boarding house, where she belonged. Look at me, lady, Amos said, his voice low and dangerous. Look at this face. Look at these hands. He held up hands that were scarred from frostbite and knife blades, thick and calloused like tree bark. I ain't some gentleman miner. I'm a mountain man. I live 60 miles from the nearest doctor, church, or store. Clara didn't blink. She held her ground. I have nothing to offer you, Amos continued, leaning in. The smell of wet wool and pine washed over her. No money, no company, no soft life. My cabin has a dirt floor. The wind blows through the chinking. You'll be entirely alone for weeks while I'm on the lines. You'll skin bloody animals. You'll wash clothes in water so cold your skin cracks open. You will work until your bones ache, and there will be no one to thank you for it. He stopped, waiting for the horror to set in, waiting for her to cry and run. Clara held his gaze. Her jaw was set. I am already freezing, Clara said, her voice eerily calm. My bones already ache. And if I stay here, I will either starve or sell myself to a man who makes me sick. Now. She looked him dead in the eye. Do you have firewood? Amos stared at her. For 10 long seconds, the only sound was the rain hitting the canvas tarps on his mules. He saw no romance in her eyes. He saw the pure, unadulterated will to survive. It was an instinct he recognized. It was the same instinct that had kept him alive when a grizzly pinned him in a snowbank 3 years ago. He slowly lowered his hands. I have firewood, 5 cords chopped and stacked. Then we have a deal, Clara said. They found Judge Hawthorne sleeping off a hangover in the back room of the assay office. He charged $2 for the license. Clara paid it from her $3.14. There were no rings. There were no vows about love or cherishing. Hawthorne slurred his way through a civil ceremony that lasted 40 seconds. "By the power vested in me by the territory," Hawthorne muttered, rubbing his temples. "You're hitched. Try not to kill each other." Amos signed the paper. Clara signed beneath him. Clara Harding was now Clara Thorne. No, she was Clara, just Clara. "Get your trunks," Amos said, stepping out into the rain. "We're losing daylight. Snow's coming." The ride up the mountain was a brutal education in gravity and cold. Amos gave Clara his riding horse, a steady roan gelding, while he walked ahead, leading the pack mules. The trail out of Copper Creek started as a muddy wagon rut, but within 2 hours it narrowed to a treacherous goat path carved into the side of a cliff. The air grew thin. The rain turned to sleet, and then, as they climbed higher, to fat, heavy flakes of snow. Amos didn't check on her. He expected her to whine. He expected her to ask to stop. He expected her to fall behind. He pushed a punishing pace, his long legs eating up the incline, testing her resolve. He was half convinced she would turn around before they hit the timberline. 4 hours in, the trail became so steep, the roan began to stumble. Amos heard the saddle creak. He turned, ready to tell her she was going to have to tough it out. Clara had already dismounted. She was wading through snow up to her calves, leading the horse by the reins. Her skirts were frozen solid at the hem, ringing like a bell against her boots. She was gasping for air in the high altitude, her face pale, but she just kept putting one foot in front of the other. She caught him watching her. She didn't say a word. She just pulled the horse forward and kept walking. Amos turned back around. A strange, unfamiliar knot tightened in his chest. Tough little bird, he thought. They reached the cabin just as the last bruised purple light faded from the sky. It sat in a clearing surrounded by ancient, towering spruce trees. It was exactly as Amos had described it. Rough-hewn logs, a heavy stone chimney, a roof patched with sod and bark. It looked less like a home and more like a bunker built to wage war against the winter. Amos unlatched the heavy timber door and pushed it open. It smelled of old wood ash, cured leather, and isolation. "Get inside," Amos ordered, tying the animals to the porch rail. "Don't touch the stove. It runs hot." Clara stepped over the threshold. It was pitch black and freezing. She stood in the center of the single room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, listening to Amos unburden the mules outside. Within minutes, Amos came in carrying a kerosene lantern and a load of wood. He struck a match. Yellow light flooded the room. Clara looked around. Dirt floor packed hard as stone. A single bed in the corner covered in a heavy buffalo robe. A rough table, 2 chairs, a cast iron stove. Shelves lined with salt, beans, and ammunition. Traps hung from the rafters like iron teeth. It was primitive. It was ugly. It was a roof. Amos got the fire going with terrifying speed. Within 10 minutes, the cast iron was ticking, radiating a fierce, localized heat. He pointed to a chair near the stove. "Sit." Clara sat. She was so cold she couldn't feel her feet. Amos went out, brought in her trunks, and dumped them near the wall. He walked to the cupboards, pulled down a tin mug, and poured coffee grounds and water into a pot on the stove. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. They were 2 strangers who had just bet their lives on each other. Amos sat on the edge of the bed, pulling off his frozen boots. He watched her. She sat rigidly in the chair, staring at the stove. "I'll build a partition," Amos said suddenly. His voice was loud in the quiet cabin. "Tomorrow, I'll string a rope and hang a canvas tarp, give you your half of the room. You sleep in the bed. I'll take a bedroll by the fire." Clara turned to him. "That isn't necessary. You're a large man. The floor will ruin your back." "I said I'll take the floor." His tone brooked no argument. "The marriage was for survival, Clara, not for a bedmate. You're safe here." Clara looked down at her hands. Slowly, the tension drained from her shoulders. "Thank you, Amos." The first week was an exercise in silent, grinding labor. There was no honeymoon. The snow fell relentlessly, burying the world outside in 3 feet of white. The silence of the mountain was deafening. It pressed against the cabin walls, heavy and absolute. Clara learned quickly that Amos wasn't a man who wasted words. He communicated in grunts, nods, and actions. He was up before dawn, gone into the freezing dark to chop more wood or scout his closest trap lines. Clara kept her end of the bargain. She woke in the freezing dark, crawling out from under the buffalo robe while Amos was still snoring on the floor. She stoked the fire. She broke the ice in the water bucket. She made biscuits and fried salt pork. It was grueling. The skin on her knuckles cracked and bled from the cold water and harsh lye soap. The smoke from the stove stung her eyes, but she never complained. Not once. She watched Amos. She watched how he moved with a dangerous, quiet grace. He was massive, terrifying in his capability. He could drag a slaughtered deer for a mile through deep snow without stopping for breath. Yet, when he was in the cabin, he moved carefully, deliberately trying not to take up too much space. By the second week, a quiet rhythm established itself, an unspoken language of survival. Clara learned that Amos hated his coffee burned. Amos learned that Clara was terrified of the dark, though she fought to hide it. One evening, a massive storm battered the cabin. The wind shrieked through the spruce trees, rattling the heavy timber door. Clara sat by the stove, darning a hole in one of Amos's heavy wool socks. The kerosene lantern flickered, threatening to blow out from a draft in the chinking near her chair. She shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. Amos was cleaning his rifle at the table. He didn't look up. He didn't say a word. He simply stood up, walked over to a stack of cured pelts, and pulled a thick, impossibly soft wolf skin from the pile. He walked over to Clara. He didn't hand it to her. He just draped it over the back of her chair, tucking it against the wall to block the draft. "Keep the wind off your neck," he muttered, turning his back immediately and going back to his rifle. Clara froze. The fur was incredibly warm. She looked at his broad back, hunched over the table in the dim light. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me," he grunted, slamming the bolt home on the rifle. "If you catch a chill and die, I gotta dig a hole in frozen ground. I hate digging in winter." Clara paused. She looked down at the sock in her lap. And then, for the first time since she had arrived in the Montana Territory, a genuine, albeit small, smile touched her lips. "Well," Clara replied, her tone perfectly matching his dry gravel, "we certainly can't have you exerting yourself on my account." Amos's hands stopped moving. He didn't turn around, but Clara saw his shoulders drop. He let out a low, breathy sound. It took her a moment to realize it was a chuckle. It was a small thing, a scrap of fur to block a draft, a tiny spark of shared humor. But in the deep, freezing isolation of the Bitterroot Mountains, it felt like someone had just lit a match in the dark. Tomorrow, Amos would leave for a 4-day run, on the far trapline. Clara would be entirely alone. The real test of their bargain was about to begin. He left before the sun breached the jagged peaks of the bitter roots. Amos stood by the door, bundled in thick wool and elk hide, a heavy pack strapped to his broad shoulders. He held his Winchester repeater in one hand. He did not look at Clara, who stood by the stove in her worn woolen dress. He looked at the wood box. He looked at the water barrel. Wood is stacked on the south wall. Don't go to the north pile. Snow drifts too deep. You'll break a leg. Amos spoke to the cast iron stove, his voice gruff. Water's drawn. Should last you. I barred the heavy shutters. Don't open them. Clara gripped a dish towel, her knuckles white. I understand. If you hear something outside, you don't open the door. I don't care if it sounds like a dying dog or a crying woman. Panthers know how to mimic things. You keep the bar dropped. I will. Amos finally turned to look at her. The cabin was dim, lit only by the orange glow of the grate. She looked impossibly small. The mountain was vast, and it ate small things. He chewed the inside of his cheek, a muscle jumping in his jaw. The shotgun is on the table, he said, his voice dropping an octave. Both barrels are loaded with double-aught buckshot. You don't aim it. You just point it at the door and pull both triggers if the wood splinters. Understand? Clara looked at the massive weapon resting on the pine table. It looked like an anvil. Yes. Amos nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. He pushed the heavy door open. The freezing air rushed in, stealing the heat from the room instantly. He stepped out into the blue pre-dawn light. The door shut with a heavy, definitive thud. The iron latch clicked. Then there was nothing. The silence of the mountain hit Clara like a physical blow. In town, there was always noise. The rattle of a wagon, the distant shout of a drunk, the barking of stray dogs. Here, there was a void so absolute it made her ears ring. She walked to the door and dropped the heavy oak bar into the iron brackets. It slid home with a solid, echoing clack. She was entirely, utterly alone. The first day was a battle against her own mind. Clara cleaned the cabin 3 times. She scrubbed the pine table with lye soap until the wood grain was pale and raw. She restacked the canned goods. She took Amos's spare wool shirts and mended microscopic tears by the light of the kerosene lamp. She did it to keep her hands moving, because if her hands stopped moving, the panic would catch up to her. By the second day, the reality of survival set in. The stove was a hungry, demanding beast. It consumed wood at a terrifying rate. By noon, the interior wood box was half empty. Clara knew she had to go outside. She layered on Amos's spare coat, a massive garment of canvas and sheepskin that hung down to her calves, and pulled on a pair of his heavy leather mittens. She unbarred the door and pushed. It wouldn't open. A fresh snowdrift had piled against the heavy timber during the night. Clara stepped back, planted her boots on the dirt floor, and threw her entire body weight against the wood. It budged an inch. She hit it again and again. On the 4th try, the snow gave way, and she spilled out onto the porch. The cold was a living, breathing thing. It seized her lungs, turning her breath into shards of glass. The sky was a flat, blinding white. She waded to the south woodpile. The logs were massive, cut for a man with a 50-inch chest. Clara wrapped her arms around a single log, hoisted it against her hip, and staggered back to the cabin. She did this 12 times. By the end of it, her back screamed in agony, her legs were shaking. and her lungs burned with the metallic taste of blood. She collapsed into the chair by the stove, stripping off the mittens. Her hands were trembling, but the fire was roaring. The cabin was warm. She had done it. 60 miles away, Amos was making a mistake. He was hurrying. A trapper who hurried was a dead man. Out here, moving too fast meant stepping blindly onto a snow bridge covering a 50-foot ravine. It meant rushing a skinning job and slipping, running a blade into your own femoral artery. You moved with deliberate, calculating patience. But Amos couldn't slow down. He checked his snares, reset his deadfalls, and skinned his catch with a brutal, restless energy. He slept in snow caves, he dug himself, huddled in his buffalo robe, chewing on frozen jerky. He should have been focused on the tracks in the snow. Instead, he was doing math. Did she have enough kindling? Did the water barrel freeze over? Did a wolf catch the scent of the salt pork? He hated it. He hated this nagging, persistent tightening in his chest. He was Amos. He was the mountain. He didn't care about anything but the yield of his furs and the powder in his horn. But on the third night, as he sat by a smokeless fire deep in a spruce thicket, he realized he was looking forward to the smell of coffee. Not just any coffee, the coffee she made. He realized he was looking forward to the sight of that ragged buffalo robe blocking the draft, placed there by a woman who didn't cry when she was afraid. He looked up at the sky. The stars were gone. The barometer was dropping fast. The air felt heavy, dead, and metallic. Amos knew that smell. It was the smell of a blue norther, a storm born in the Arctic, capable of dropping 4 feet of snow in 10 hours and plunging the temperature to 40 below zero. He packed his gear in the dark. He abandoned his last 6 traps. He strapped on his bare paw snowshoes and began the brutal 20-mile trek back to the cabin. He had to beat the storm. He didn't. The blizzard hit Copper Creek Mountain 2 hours past noon. It did not announce itself with a gentle flurry. It slammed into the ridges like a freight train of white ice. Inside the cabin, Clara heard it before she saw it. A low guttural roar echoed down the chimney, followed by a concussive blast of wind that shook the very foundation of the heavy logs. The kerosene lamp flickered wildly as fine powdery snow blasted through the microscopic cracks in the chinking. Within minutes, it was pitch black outside. The windows were entirely blinded by driving white snow. Clara stood in the center of the room, listening to the shrieking wind. The temperature inside the cabin was already dropping. The draft was pulling the heat straight up the chimney. She checked the wood box. She had enough for maybe 4 hours if she ran the stove hot enough to keep from freezing. She had to conserve it. She fed the fire a single log, wrapping herself in her blankets and Amos's heavy canvas coat, sitting practically on top of the cast iron. By nightfall, the wind sounded like 1,000 screaming women. The cabin was freezing. The water in the barrel had developed a 2-inch crust of ice. Clara fed the last log into the stove. She stared at the dying orange embers. She knew the arithmetic of this situation just as she had known it on the boardwalk in town. If the fire died, she would be dead by morning. She looked at the heavy pine table. She looked at the wooden chairs. Clara stood up. She walked to the corner, picked up Amos's heavy splitting maul, and dragged it to the center of the room. She swung it over her shoulder and brought it down on one of the wooden chairs. It shattered into jagged splinters. She broke the second chair. She started feeding the varnished wood into the stove. It burned hot and fast. It wasn't enough. The cold was seeping into her bones. She couldn't feel her toes. A dangerous, heavy lethargy began to pull at her eyelids. It would be so easy to just close them. Just sleep for a moment. Outside, in the howling white void, Amos was dying. He had pushed himself past the limits of human endurance. His right snowshoe had snapped an hour ago, forcing him to wallow waist-deep through the drifts. Ice encased his beard, freezing his lips shut. He couldn't feel his hands or his feet. The wind battered him, physically knocking him down twice. He was disoriented. The landscape was wiped clean. There were no landmarks, no trees, no ridges, just a swirling, screaming vortex of white. Stand up. The thought was sluggish, buried under a thick layer of exhaustion. Stand up, you fool, she's alone. Amos forced his frozen arms to push against the snow. He dragged himself upright. He took one step, then another. He was entirely blind. He was walking on pure, primal instinct. Suddenly he smelled it. It was faint, snatched away by the wind almost instantly, but it was there. Wood smoke. And not just pine. The acrid, chemical smell of burning varnish. He pivoted, leaning into the gale, moving toward the scent. 10 minutes later, his gloved hand slammed into something solid. Rough-hewn bark. The cabin wall. He dragged himself along the logs, feeling blindly for the door. He found the iron latch. His hands were too frozen to grip it. He balled his hands into fists and smashed them against the heavy timber. Inside, Clara jolted awake. She had slumped against the side of the stove. The fire was down to a handful of glowing coals. She heard a heavy, rhythmic thudding over the roar of the wind. Panthers know how to mimic things, Amos had said. She stood up, her legs numb and trembling. She walked to the table. She picked up the massive double-barreled shotgun. It weighed 10 pounds. She could barely lift it to her shoulder. She pointed it dead center at the heavy door. Thud, thud, then a voice. It was barely a rasp, torn to shreds by the wind. Clara? She dropped the gun. It hit the dirt floor with a heavy thud. She threw herself at the door, grabbing the heavy oak bar. It was frozen in the brackets. She screamed in frustration, using both hands, tearing the skin from her palms as she wrenched the bar upward. She yanked the door open. Amos collapsed inward, a mountain of ice and canvas, spilling onto the dirt floor. The blizzard rushed in behind him, instantly blowing out the lantern. Clara threw her entire body against the door, fighting the wind, shoving it shut and dropping the bar back into place. She crawled through the pitch black to where Amos lay. He wasn't moving. "Amos!" She shook his massive shoulder. "Amos, wake up!" He groaned, a weak, shallow sound. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She dragged him toward the stove. He weighed over 250 pounds. She pulled until her shoulders popped, inching him across the dirt floor. She didn't think. She acted. She shoved the last broken pieces of the table into the stove to build the heat. She grabbed his frozen knife from his belt and began cutting away his rigid, ice-caked clothes. She couldn't untie the frozen leather laces of his boots, so she sawed through them, ripping the heavy leather off his blue, frost-bitten feet. She stripped him down to his wool union suit. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard she feared he would shatter them. She dragged the heavy buffalo robe off the bed, threw it over him, and then she crawled underneath it with him. She pressed her body against his massive, freezing frame, wrapping her arms around his chest, sharing every ounce of her core heat. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely against his neck, rubbing her rough, blistered hands up and down his arms. "Don't you dare die! You promised me a roof. You promised me survival. You do not get to leave me here alone." Amos drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain of the thaw was agonizing. His hands and feet, it felt like they were plunged into boiling water. But through the haze of agony, he felt something else. A steady rhythmic heartbeat against his chest, soft breaths against his neck, the fierce, unyielding grip of small, blistered hands holding him tethered to the earth. He didn't open his eyes. He just weakly lifted one massive arm and wrapped it around her back, pulling her closer. They stayed like that for 2 days. When the storm finally broke on the morning of the 3rd day, the silence returned to the mountain. A brilliant, blinding sunlight poured through the cracks in the shutters. Amos opened his eyes. The cabin was a wreck. The chairs were gone. A chunk of the table was missing. The fire was dead. He pushed himself up. His body ached with a profound, terrifying weariness. His hands were raw, red, and swollen, but the black rot of deep frostbite hadn't set in. He would keep his fingers. He would keep his toes. He looked down. Clara was asleep on his chest, wrapped in his heavy coat. Her blonde hair was tangled, her face smeared with soot. He gently lifted her hand. He stared at it. The skin on her knuckles was cracked and bleeding. Blisters covered her palms from chopping wood. Her fingernails were chipped and bruised. They were the hands of a survivor. They were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Clara stirred. She opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh shafts of sunlight. She looked up and saw Amos watching her. His slate-gray eyes weren't dead and calm anymore. They were wide open, raw, and entirely stripped of their armor. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice cracking. Amos sat up slowly, pulling her up with him. He didn't let go of her hand. He held it between both of his massive paws. "You burned the chairs," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "You're lucky I didn't burn the bed." Amos looked around the freezing, battered cabin. He looked at the frost clinging to the walls. He looked back at Clara. The cynical, hardened wall he had built around himself for 30 years, finally, entirely collapsed. "I told you," Amos said, his voice shaking with a sudden, overwhelming emotion he couldn't name. "I told you I had nothing to offer you. Look at this. Look at what I dragged you into. You almost died because of me." Clara didn't pull her hand away. She didn't look away from his intense, tortured gaze. She shifted closer, bridging the final inches between them. "You arrogant, stubborn man," Clara said softly, her blue eyes blazing with a fierce, quiet fire. She reached up with her free hand, tracing the scarred line of his cheekbone, feeling the rough bristle of his beard. The touch wasn't delicate. It was firm, anchoring him. "You told me you had a drafty cabin and dirt floors," Clara continued, her voice steady in the freezing air. "You told me you had no money, no soft life, and nothing to give a lady." "I was right," he whispered. "No," Clara said, her voice turning fierce. "You were wrong. I was standing in the mud, Amos. I was a dead woman waiting for a pine box. Do you know what you offered me?" Amos couldn't speak. He just shook his head. "You offered me a door to lock," Clara said, her thumb brushing a streak of soot from his face. "You offered me a fire to tend. You offered me safety when the whole world wanted to chew me up and spit me out. You gave me my life." She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. "You gave me my life," she repeated, her breath warm against his skin. "And now I am giving you mine. There is no bargain anymore, Amos. There is only this. there is only us. Amos closed his eyes. A single hot tear broke free, tracking down his weathered cheek, instantly cooling in the frigid air. He wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her tangled hair. He held her like a drowning man holding a piece of driftwood. He held her like she was the only warm thing left in the entire world. He didn't say he loved her. He didn't need to. The way he pressed his mouth against her temple, desperate and reverent, said everything the mountain had never allowed him to say. The spring thaw came late to the Bitterroots that year. When the snow finally retreated, leaving the high meadows awash in violent green grass and purple lupine, Amos loaded the mules for the journey down to Copper Creek. He didn't just pack furs. He packed the shattered pieces of the chairs and the table. He was going to buy proper lumber. He was going to buy glass for a real window. He was going to buy a ring. As he tightened the diamond hitch, he looked toward the cabin porch. Clara stood there in the morning sun. Her skin was tanned by the high-altitude glare, her hands strong and calloused. She wore a dress she had sewn from one of his old flannel shirts, and she looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. Amos walked over to her. He didn't say a word. He just hooked a thick finger under her chin, tipped her head back, and kissed her. It was a hard, slow kiss that tasted of coffee and fresh pine. "I'll be back in 5 days," Amos said against her lips. "Bar the door." Clara smiled, a slow, brilliant thing that lit up the entire valley. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore, Amos. But hurry back. The stove gets hungry." Amos turned and took the lead rope. He walked down the trail, not as a solitary ghost haunting the ridges, but as a man who knew exactly where he belonged. A man who had offered nothing and somehow gained the entire world. Did Clara and Amos's story of brutal survival and unexpected love grip your heart? True romance isn't always found in grand ballrooms. Sometimes it's forged in the harshest winters and the darkest nights, built on resilience, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of choosing each other when the world offers nothing else. If you loved this deep, gritty Western tale, please hit that like button to let us know. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who appreciates a grounded, real love story. And subscribe to the channel for more deeply human stories of grit and passion.